This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you again for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. My guest today is Professor Elizabeth Corey. She is a professor of political science in the honors program at Baylor University. She has her Ph.D. in political science from Louisiana State University and also an MA from Louisiana State and degrees from University of Heidelberg in Germany, an MA in art history and a BA in classics from Oberlin College. And luckily, I've never been to Edinburgh. She studied in Scotland, so I'm a little jealous of that. She has written a number of things. She writes in a lot of different journals. You can learn more about her, and I'll put links up to her bio on the Moral Imagination website. So thank you again for listening. Thanks to all of those who have written reviews. If you like the podcast, please do write a review. Apple Podcasts, give it a 5-star review if you like it. It's very helpful. It grows the podcast. And thanks to all those who've contributed to the podcast on Patreon. So today we're going to talk about the work of the British philosopher Michael Oakeshott, and also this idea of a disposition of delight. What does it mean to be a conservative? How to think about politics, rationalism and politics. And then also, what insights does he have for us today as we think about how to navigate in the contemporary world of 2021? So, Professor Corey, thank you very much for joining the Moral Imagination Podcast.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here.
So let's begin. You know, we were talking about doing a podcast and what to talk about. And I said, well, what would you like to talk about? And you said, well, what if we did something with like Michael Oakeshott and the limits of politics? That sometimes we're so focused on the political that we miss that the political has limits, and that in fact, we also have to focus on other parts of life. And you thought that Oakeshott would be a really good way to kind of bring us into this theme. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and why you think it's so important?
Sure. It's interesting with respect to Oakeshott because he is known primarily among those who know him as a political philosopher, and that is what he was. But in many ways, he's an unusual political philosopher because he thinks about politics as a secondary activity. It is not the primary thing that human beings ought to be engaged in doing with the majority of their lives. We can talk more about this as we go, but it's a very countercultural view in the modern day, because what do we think about politics as being? Well, it's the prosecution of grand plans. It's making vast societal changes. It's doing all sorts of things for the direct benefit of citizens of a nation. But Oakeshott thought that politics was essentially as we've just said, a limited activity, and that it was aimed at facilitating human goods that were self-chosen, that could be pursued in groups and among individuals, but that you ought not to spend all of your time doing politics. And I think one of the things that he is so helpful in showing us, especially in the hyper-politicized environment of 2021, is that there are many things that we ought to do that are not political, and the political is constantly infringing on those spheres. I mean, through social media, just through technology, I mean, in all the ways we're very familiar with. But he wanted to carve out a space for the pursuit of things that are not in themselves political. Things like, famously, he would say, friendship, love, contemplation, liberal learning. I mean, that is a real preoccupation of his. What is it? What is liberal learning? Why should we pursue it? And what does it produce in a person? All those things he thought needed to be extricated from politics. And I don't think we do a very good job of doing that right now. And certainly political considerations sort of horn in on everything we do in ordinary daily life. And so I think Oakeshott is important for helping us to see that can be resisted. It's not easy to resist it, but it ought to be resisted.
So that's good. I want to go into this in more detail after we go through some of Oakeshott's key ideas. But maybe just briefly, could you develop that a little bit, give an example of what you mean by saying, we have to extricate the non-political from the political and be able to live with this carved out of space that's not infected by politics. I think a lot of people, one, would just say, okay, I'm open to that, but what do you mean? And two, and we'll talk about this, I think, in more detail, like, how do you do that? So maybe just give like a big picture theme, and then we can go back to some of the details later.
I think one of the best examples of what I'm trying to convey here and what Oakeshott was conveying is the contemporary university. And I've written some about this, and I've promoted the idea that we ought to approach university education disinterestedly. And what Oakeshott would mean by that, and what I mean by that, is to say, look, there is no realm of life in which politics seems to have dominated than education. We hear all the time about woke universities doing diversity trainings and doing all sorts of things so that the faculty and the students come to hold a view that is essentially political, and it's often political progressivism. It's usually political progressivism. Oakeshott would be horrified at this. He would say, look, universities are not places where we are politically indoctrinated, neither on the left or on the right. And what he was trying to preserve, and when I say preserve a space for, he would have said, look, liberal learning is not about politics. Liberal learning is a good in itself. We read the great works of the Western tradition and other traditions too, for their own sake and for the enlightenment that they bring to us, and for the kind of personal gratification, in a way, in a very sincere way, of what those works have for us. So university education is one place where I think he would say, I would say this, I wish we could get the politics out of the universities so that we could do the thing that universities were meant to do, and always did for a very long time. I mean, I'm now 30 years out of college, but I went to a very political school. But even there were many professors who just didn't talk about politics in the classroom. And that's, to my mind, increasingly rare, or it has become increasingly rare over the past 3 decades.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little. I think some people would say, right, well, isn't reading the great books a political act? I mean, that's not a neutral act. It's already political. And so the kind of, we'll take, a Marxian critique or a class critique of some sort, is actually trying to upend this way of thinking about university education, which in fact is already pre-political, and that what you really want is not just to depoliticize it, but to politicize it in your favor. What would you first say to that? And then maybe we'll talk about your experience, at Oberlin in a political place. But what would you say to that critique?
Well, I guess I would come back at a question to you, which is that in what way would you make the argument that reading these books is a political act already? I mean, what is it about reading these things that is political?
Well, I guess people could say, by choosing these books, so whether it's the Greek tradition, right, Plato and Aristotle, or Iliad and Odyssey, Augustine, Dante, and then on even into, like, say, political philosophers and literature from Hobbes and Locke and Shakespeare, you're choosing a certain kind of hyper-Western dominated view of the world that suits your conservative agenda, at least broadly. And that's a political act. And I mean, I think you mentioned in one of your essays, the Paulo Freire, what's his last name? Freire, in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right? That, there's this idea that these books themselves are pre-political and they're meant to indoctrinate you in a certain way. That's, I think, what someone would say by that. How do you respond?
Yeah, that's a great question. That in a sense, choosing the West is in a way already to reinforce Western values of hierarchy and patriarchy and domination and all the things that Freire is trying to oppose. I guess I mean, there's a very practical way of thinking about it, that we are inheritors of this tradition, whether we like it or not. And so if we are going to be critics of the tradition, as Freire is, I think we need to know it first. I remember making this argument to somebody at a job interview years and years ago, and she said, well, these are all patriarchal thinkers. They're white men. They're dominating women, and the usual litany of things. And I said, but okay, you can say that, but have you read what they actually wrote? And she said, well, not really, because I don't choose to read those things. So it's a kind of dismissal of the whole tradition as patriarchal and as wrong without having sort of grappled with it. Alan Jacobs is a colleague of mine at Baylor, and he has a wonderful new book, and it's the title is escaping me. It's called Breaking Bread with the Dead. And in that book, he says, look, it is not the case that everything we read is going to accord perfectly with our 21st century values or what we think are our values. But that is not a reason to dismiss the books themselves. We need to know what they said evaluate them carefully and charitably. And then, it is the case that you're free to criticize. The other thing is that many of these books are not necessarily supporting conservative causes. I mean,
Right.
we read Marx, we read Nietzsche. Those guys are all included too. So it's not as if we're reading,
Right.
only Plato and Homer. And it's debatable to what extent any of those guys are actually promoting Western liberal values. I don't think
Right.
they are, because they weren't.
Right.
So
that'd be one reason why they.
yes,
they
exactly.
Well, and I think so. I mean, and also, I agree with you. So I'm playing devil's advocate here because I think it's important that we try to wrestle with these things. But I think another question is, I interviewed a lady named Heidi White who does classical education, like high school, and she's at the Cersei Institute. And we talked a little bit about the great books and why to read them. And one of the things that being able to read the great books, as you said, you enter into the tradition. And entering the tradition, you wrestle with the fundamental questions of human existence. I mean, they're classical great books for a reason. And in doing that, or in not doing that, you're much more susceptible to kind of contemporary propaganda than you would be if you've actually wrestled with the great tradition and with history. And I sometimes say, I interviewed Noelle Mering on her book, Awake, Not Woke. And one of the things we talked about, I used to tell my undergraduate students, you may not have heard of Nietzsche, but he's heard of you. Meaning, right, that we're influenced by a lot of thinkers, whether we know it or not. And so engaging in that tradition and realizing, wait, I hold this position, but where does it come from? And does it actually align with other deeper held positions I have? And how do I think about justice? Am I making a mistake? Am I just buying into whatever happens to be contemporary? And I think this is really, I would say, one of the things that I argue of why you need to read old books is because Chesterton has this line, like, it's about the church, the Catholic Church, but he says, it's the one thing that saves you from the embarrassing situation of being a child of your age. And I think that the great books can do that as well, reading that literature. And when it's hyper politicized, it's a problem. And then just one more quick example. I was in Rome giving some lectures, and I was talking to some of the seminarians. And one of the seminarians was from India. He's a Catholic seminarian. And we were talking about the Western questions. And he said, don't you think we should read also some like Indian texts and Indian philosophy? I said, yeah. I mean, I don't really know it. So to my shame, I don't know it. So I said, well, let me, what would you read? And I said, well, what would be some arguments? And he went through this argument of society. And I said, okay, listen, I'm absolutely interested in reading Indian philosophy, but that's not Indian philosophy. That's 19th century German philosophy, right? Because he was basically giving me a Marxian analysis, right? And I think you have to know like the pedigree of your thought a bit. That was what I would say. I don't know. Do you disagree with that?
No, of course I don't. I totally agree. And well, what Oakeshott says also is that it's your inheritance. I mean, and you can reject it and you can say, I don't want to know what it is, but it is your inheritance. And if you choose to take it, then you can only get the inheritance by doing the work of figuring out what's there. I mean, it's not like an inheritance. You get a house or a piece of jewelry that someone gives to you and you can just take it. But the inheritance is earned. And I do think it's worth earning. Obviously, I suspect most of the listeners to this podcast will as well. But I mean, you think about somebody like Augustine. I mean, if your view of politics is that politics is everything, as many progressive friends of mine seem to think.
And some conservatives, right?
And, absolutely. And some conservatives. That's quite right. The tendency now is to think, well, politics is all, it covers everything. And Augustine is a wonderful check on that. Once you understand these notions of the city of God and the city of man, you've got a different frame of reference. And you may not be a Christian even, but the idea that there could be different frames of human existence on the earth is helpful in checking some of that idea that, politics is everything, which I think we're increasingly prone to in the present day.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to, I think one of the things you bring out in your essays on Oakeshott, and I'll put links to all those essays, they're great, on the Moral Imagination website. But you talk about like how Oakeshott has this distinction of modes of experience and knowing, right? And by making those distinctions of modes of experience and knowing, maybe it helps us escape a bit from the hyper-politicized, everything is politics worldview, because you're able to say, well, I can know things in different ways. Do you want to talk a little bit about those modes of experience and why they matter and how they're not only crucial for understanding Oakeshott, but why you think he's valuable for our time?
Yes, I think this is one of the most important parts of Oakeshott's thought. He wrote a book called Experience and Its Modes back in the 1920s. He was a very young man, or maybe it was early 1930s, but it was when he was very young. And he was following in the idealist philosophy of people like F.H. Bradley and Collingwood. And he set out this framework, which he called modality, and other people have as well. And in this modal framework, you can view the world in a variety of modes. And the example I always use to explain this is the example of the water bottle. And it's a very helpful way of seeing what he's after. He says, look, you can view the world through the practical mode. You can view it through the historical mode. You can view it through the scientific mode. And later he will say, and this is a very important mode, you can view it through the poetic or the contemplative mode. So imagine you have in front of you a water bottle. And I ask you, well, what is this water bottle? And you would say, well, it's a conveyance for getting water to my mouth. And that's a modal answer. That's a modal answer because it is the practical mode. And that is the mode that is the most dominant, the one we almost always live in, which is, how do I get what I want? How can I help my family to flourish? How can I act in politics? I mean, it really is where most of life goes on. And so a water bottle, understood there, is a way of getting water to your mouth. It's like a glass. Now, okay, let's start over. I'm going to show you a water bottle. What is it? But don't give me it's getting water to your mouth answer. And sometimes I ask people to say that, and they'll say, well, it's the modern version of the Thracian drinking horn. Okay, that's a weird answer. Actually, nobody's ever said that, but that's what I say. Okay, what kind of answer is that? It's a historical answer, because it is the modern version of this thing that's been around for a very long time in different forms. So the water bottle there is in a line of historical continuity, but it's a very different answer from the practical one.
I just want to say, I think that's for any younger listeners who are in a class and you have some curmudgeonly teacher and he says, "What are you drinking the water for?" Say, it's just a variation of a Thracian horn. I think it's like what, you opposed to tradition? I think it's just a really good rhetorical.
It'd be a great response, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah, there you go. Okay, so you've got the historical and the practical mode.
Yes, and then of course you can answer it in the scientific mode, which is, I'm least comfortable in that, but I know it's made up of polymers and molecules, and you could give a scientific answer to what this plastic water bottle is. So as you can see, seeing the world in these different modes it's distinguishable. I mean, the world is distinguishable in terms of science from the world in terms of history and from the world in terms of practice. And that we tend to live in the practical mode is true, and we're not going to get away from that. But what Oakeshott says, and what I love in Oakeshott, is that you can get out of that practical mode at times. You can do history for its own sake. You can do science for its own sake. And the most important mode, I would argue, for Oakeshott is this aesthetic mode, or what he calls the voice of poetry. He's got a very interesting essay in his compilation of essays called Rationalism in Politics. And this essay is called The Voice of Poetry in the Conversation of Mankind. And he delineates a mode of contemplation, which is stepping out of practice, stepping out of history, stepping out of science, and enjoying and delighting in something for its own sake. And that can be done with all sorts of aesthetic things. It can be done with things that are practical and then turned aesthetic, like a basket in a museum that was originally utilitarian, but it's become an object of contemplation. And importantly, and I think this really is at the heart of his thought, you can also do that with practical activities. So you can understand friendship, as, well, I'm friends with so-and-so because he has a nice car and he can take me places. I mean, that's a very utilitarian understanding of friendship, not a very good one. But Oakeshott says you can also understand friends contemplatively, so that you delight in the person for his own sake, because he is his unique self, and you can love and enjoy that person. And you could take that attitude towards all sorts of things, toward marriage, toward friendship, toward even parenting at times. Of course, the practical breaks back in, but there's a kind of freedom that comes with the aesthetic mode. And I think that's kind of a brief overview of his modes to get us started.
That's good. I think, and I think that'll lead us into some of why you think he's important, right? That getting out of the practical scientific modes and getting into the poetic mode is important to prevent us from becoming hyper-politicized, right? That's
exactly.
Okay. And I mean, what's interesting too about that, I mean, there's a couple of thoughts that just came to me. One is, in many ways, this is really aligned in the tradition. I mean, you see this in Aristotle with friendship, right? There's the utilitarian friendship, and
yes.
Right? And then there's the friendship for the good of just being friends, right? The good it is. I sometimes talk about the work of Dietrich von Hildebrand. I've talked about this before. He has these three categories: the subjectively satisfying, the genuinely beneficial, and that which is valuable for its own sake. And
very similar.
Yeah, I think there's, and then, and of course, you quote Joseph Pieper in some of your essays, who I think really does a lot of work on contemplation. And he has a beautiful quote, which I could find, but it's something to the effect of, you have to contemplate on truths to make them present to you. And so if you get stuck in this practical world, it's interesting. The other thought I had was, and one more part of the tradition that I talk about a lot. I'm a big fan of St. Bonaventure. And Bonaventure has this concept of the semiotic metaphysics, right? That things are a thing in themselves, but they're also a sign pointing to God. And there's something rich in the thing. And if you only reduce it to its practical or scientific element, then you're making, I think, the classic error of reducing the whole to its part, right? It's the meteorological fallacy. And I think Roger Scruton writes about this a lot. A lot of people, I mean, this is I think an error, and maybe it's an error of all of life, right? Maybe that's just the way it's always been because we're practical, right? And so that's why all the ancient writers are stressing it. But it seems maybe even more of a problem today that we get stuck in this kind of efficient cause, practical, scientific, and then we miss the bigger picture. What do you think about that? Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. And another interesting thing that Oakeshott brings out is the way in which the practical mode kind of goes on steroids in the terms of what are people preoccupied with in the present day. And this is, I mean, when I say present day, I'm thinking all the way from 1900 to now. Those were Oakeshott's. Oakeshott was born in 1901 and died in 1990. And he said, well, it's all about achievement. It's this kind of pathological desire to be a success, to be famous, to be known, to be out there. And if he thought that was bad in his day, I mean, can you imagine what he would think now of Twitter and Facebook? And
can we just pause and ask people to follow me on Twitter, please? No, exactly. I mean, it's a disaster. Keep going. Sorry, I was just making a joke.
Well, no, it is funny because people do this without thinking about it now. But there's this kind of pathology of you've got to be seen to be doing things and to be doing things extremely well and to be contributing to a future state of yourself and your career and your reputation. And all of that, Oakeshott says, is a kind of hyper practical life that is deeply unsatisfying, because he says, look, first of all, you might just die in the middle of it, in which case you wouldn't have enjoyed life. Yeah. You'll die young. You don't achieve what you set out to achieve. But also you're not looking at what's around you. You're not observing the beauty of the world around you. In that sense, I think it's a very Christian view. Oakeshott is an ambiguously Christian thinker. I mean, we could talk about that on its own. But I mean, as a Christian, what are you required to do? Well, love your neighbor, love God and love your neighbor, but also be grateful for what you're given. And Oakeshott is great on that. And I take that from him in terms of Christianity as well.
Yeah, I thought, as I said, I kind of holding off a little bit on this theme because I think there's some practical things to do, and you write about those. But I think that's right. That the hyper practical. I mean, you had a section, I'm trying to remember one of your essays where you're talking about, like, it's totally true. Like, if I could just lose a couple more pounds, if I could just get this thing done, if I can just, if I can get this many more followers, or if I can accomplish this thing. And then you have a quote in another essay where you quote Goethe's Faust, which is, this guy's working to accomplish all these things. He's going to get everything done, and he's going to make the world a great place. And quote, and long before the halfway point is reached, they bury the poor devil in the ground.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's a fear, in a sense, that we all have. You're like, wait a minute, what am I doing this for? And I actually thought I wish I could remember all three of them. I can't find it right now in your essays, but just a couple more pounds and I'll be there. Just to the couple more. And it's like, you're never satisfied. You're always on the future self. And so this theme in Oakeshott of this disposition of delight, that you're just kind of taking in the beauty of the world, is lost. And the other thing I thought about with Tocqueville. Not Tocqueville, with Oakeshott. I talk a lot, which is people who know me know I talk a lot. And so I always think like, okay, I got to stop talking and get working. But Oakeshott actually says you should, conversation is a good thing. And it made me actually think sometimes I'll have a conversation, it's a good conversation. And I almost feel like, okay, yeah, but what was I doing? Well, I was having a really good conversation about something important. And that's good enough.
Yeah. And he would say that is an end. That is an absolutely vital end. In fact, it's one of his highest ends. Notice the name of that essay I was referencing was The Voice of Poetry and the Conversation of Mankind. I mean, conversation is his metaphor for education, so that you're engaging in conversation, whether it's in a university or with a friend, it is a kind of education. And the aim of it is not to get to some final point where everyone agrees, but to learn, to share. I mean, that starts to sound a little new agey, but he doesn't put it that way. It is though the end in itself. And that's exactly what you're talking about. When you have a good conversation with someone, you ought not to be thinking, well, what did I accomplish in that conversation?
Right.
Take the conversation for what it is.
I thought, as I went through all your essays, I mean, that kind of stood out to me. And the funny thing is, I was like, you talk about just the importance of reading poetry and engaging in good literature. And I thought, oh, that's true. I got to make sure I get a checklist to, to check these off. So it's like almost immediately to like future orientation of success, which is really exhausting. And I think you also say like, look, there's a place for the person of the present. There's a phrase in kind of Catholic phrase called the sacrament of the present moment, that you meet God in the sacrament of the present moment, right? Not in worrying about the past or worrying about the future, but in the sacrament of the present moment. And that in the sacrament of the present moment, part of that is being prudent, which is seeing the world as it is and acting accordingly. And that, yes, I need to make sure I plan for the future because I have to make sure that I'm prepared to care for people and everything. But that what I liked about how you articulate is it's hyper practical and hyper future oriented. So everything's about the future. And so you miss the present.
Yes, and Oakeshott is not saying, interestingly, Oakeshott's not saying that you shouldn't attend to the practical. I mean, he was chair of a department at the London School of Economics for many, many years. And from all I'm told, he was extremely good at it. So what do you do as a chair of a department? Well, you're constantly thinking about the future. You're thinking about the practical things that have to be taken care of for your faculty, for your students. I mean, it's just inordinately practical stuff. That stuff is going to be there. Is what he's saying is that stuff is going to be there, and you do have to attend to that. So he's not saying you're going to go off and live some sort of romantic life in the present where you never think of the future. But the fact that most of us never even conceive that as a way of being is a problem for him.
Right.
And is a problem for Joseph Pieper as well, because, leisure is supposed to be that kind of, present focused activity of a human being, and we don't make time for that because we're always worried about what's coming next.
Right.
And this is a very personal thing for me. I mean, I'm the queen of to-do lists, so it's not as if I don't feel this practical pressure, and it's not as if I'm going out and reading literature and poetry all the time. But I know that is an important way of being, and Oakeshott shows it, and he shows it in a very convincing way.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think that's like Pieper does too, like this in tune with the world, right? That's one of his famous books. It's really good. The other just quick thing I think that struck me as you were talking about the modes, this is something I've been thinking about. There's this new movement called Beyond Meat. Have you heard of this?
No.
Okay, so this idea that we have to stop eating meat because, this is very short, but, cattle are not really good for the environment. Meat's not good for the environment. We just don't eat meat. So there's a company, I think, called Beyond Meat, and there's a little thing on Twitter, and the guy kept up. He says, if we're only think about meat, and this is a paraphrase, as the flesh of a chicken or a cow or a pig, well, then we're stuck. But if we can think about meat as, amino acids and trace minerals and water, well, then we can eat meat without eating meat. And my first reaction, I'm a Catholic. I was like, well, wait a minute. Because he says, just change your perspective. And I thought, as a Catholic, I'm like, wait a minute. If I change my perspective and I don't call hamburgers meat, I can eat them on Friday.
Exactly.
Right. So that was my practical reaction. But I think of course it's absurd, but I think again, it's the whole part element, right? It's this hyper reduction that you miss the whole for the part. You reduce it to the part. And I think that's another thing I liked about this modality, right? That, as you said, he's he kind of challenges us away from that reductionism. Because if we only think of things in their practical, scientific, or historical way, then we actually can lose their meaning, their significance. And I thought that was really important.
One last thing I would say is I actually think he does think that there is a value in looking at things historically or scientifically. I mean, and where does that take place? Usually at universities or I suppose at institutes of various kinds. But it's very hard to get yourself to a place where you're actually doing history because you find it illuminating. It's so much more common to hear people say, well, you don't want to, Santayana's supposedly famous line, I don't even know if he ever said it, you don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. You don't want to be subject to the ignorance that you could have prevented. That's a very practical way of thinking of history. And Oakeshott would say, no, there actually is a much purer understanding of history, which is infrequently attained, but it's there. And the same for science and for contemplation. I think the mode he's most worried about is the practical mode, just because it's so natural to us. And it's so overbearing. And to even recognize that there's another mode is a challenge for some people.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I'm glad you made that point, is it's a moderate position. He's not saying, don't do practical things, history. No. He's just saying, we're forgetting the poetic mode. And I think, again, that's where he aligns with Pieper and so many of the kind of modern contemplative philosophers who are saying you're forgetting that element. But I think related to that then is another, one of probably his most famous position, right, or essay, is this idea of rationalism in politics, right? So that kind of related that with this limited mode, this is not maybe a direct line, but it's connected to a dominant theme in modernity. And by modernity, it's not even modernity, I guess it's throughout history, but it gets exacerbated in modernity, of this idea of rationalism in politics. Can you talk a little bit about this idea in Oakeshott, why you think it's important and what we can learn from it?
Sure. The essence of rationalism in Oakeshott is not, as some people will say, that you should or shouldn't think about things in terms of rational, reasoned propositions.
Right.
The rationalist for him is someone who understands life in a particular way. And the way the rationalist understands life is sort of directly the opposite of this poetic vision I've been talking about. It is somebody who sees life and politics in particular as a succession of problems to be solved. And he thinks that with the application of his unaided reason, he can figure out solutions to all those problems, and that it's actually his duty to do so. I use the word his and he because, as many people have pointed out, men tend to be a little bit more rationalist than women, in the sense that women often are willing to just sort of muddle through and be spontaneous about solving problems. The rationalist is somebody who says, look, I've got the whole abstract understanding of politics and society and how we can make it better. In many ways, it does mirror kind of progressivism. And let me show you how, and I will do that. It's very much, we may talk about this later, Michael, but this image of the Tower of Babel, that if you could just get it right and build the tower in the right way, then you could be like God. And so Oakeshott thinks that's a misunderstanding of politics, and it's a misunderstanding of knowledge, because he thinks it requires a kind of technical knowledge. You could learn what you need in politics by means of a rule book, and he thinks that's patently false, and I do too, for a number of reasons. So that's just a sort of an outline. The rationalist is unsatisfied with the present. He wants to work to solve problems, and he wants to do so by means of a technique.
Yeah, I think that's good. I'm just trying to look at one of where you talk about rationalism. I think you have a really good kind of summary quote where you say, the rationalist conduct, you say, is grounded not in tradition or habit, but in self-conscious reflection relying upon ideologies or abridgments to guide his moral and political activity. And I like this idea where I think you use the example of a shortcuts. It's like the way I sometimes think about it is that it's an ideology. It's like the bed of Procrustes. Like I've got this theory, and I'm going to fit reality into my pre-existing theory, and we're going to solve the world's problems. And I sometimes talk about it as the primacy of the technical, this idea that you can solve the problems of evil, sin, suffering, and death through technical political means. Is that aligned?
That's exactly right. No, I think that's right. Let me just take a little easier, sort of more homey example. I play the piano, and I was a pianist for many years. And I recognize that, and as Oakeshott will in terms of politics and in many other things, there's a whole lot of piano playing that comes about only by means of practicing. I mean, in terms of practicing, I don't mean just sitting hours at the piano, but by doing it. So that if you are somebody who has played the piano for 30 years, you have a kind of Aristotelian hexis, Aristotelian habit of activity and ability that cannot be reproduced by somebody who has studied for 1 year. And there's also, in the terms of thinking about this, there's also a mistake in understanding that you could learn from a book how to play the piano. I mean, think about all the things that are on YouTube now, learn to do, wood furniture making just by following these 10 steps. And, that it's the notion is that you could learn everything you needed to learn from a technique book. And that is the way the rationalist approaches politics, by means of an ideology, this sort of distilled, this is the way things are, and this is how we can make them better. When Oakeshott thinks actually the really most important activity comes out of a long habit of doing. And I think he's right about that, because you can't learn to play the piano with any artistry or skill online or with merely a technique book. You simply have to do it. You have to watch others who do it well, and you have to kind of find your way into it.
That's really helpful. And by the way, when we met, I said, you wrote this piece. I couldn't remember what it was. And I was like, what was it? I was trying to figure out this piece you wrote it. And then all of a sudden it showed up. I don't know if I told you this. It showed up, and it was an essay that you wrote on piano playing that I read years ago. So that's a great essay. Where was that? Do you remember? Because
it was in First Things.
Was that in First Things?
Called Learning to Play.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's funny because I had printed it, and the other day, not too long ago, I said, that's the piece I was looking for. So my children are so bad at the piano, I just gave them that. No, I'm teasing. I'm just teasing. Well, I think that you bring up a couple things I want to just address really quickly, but before we move on, because I think you number one of the I give a lecture on what is the moral imagination, and one of the things I talk about in the moral imagination is this idea of inarticulate rationality, right? So Michael Polanyi, this personal knowledge,
very similar,
and that you don't learn piano simply from technique. You actually learn it, one, by doing it. You can't articulate exactly all that you can do, but you also learn it, in a sense, on the knee of the master, like at the elbow of the master. Like you learn liberty on the knee of your parents and grandparents. You learn violin at the elbow of the master. And that inarticulate rationality is, I think, it's one of the problems with a limited view of reason. And this is, I think, kind of a bit off topic. So maybe you can come back and we can have a discussion about this, because I think it's so important. And I always talk about this kind of limited rationality on the podcast. But that inarticulate rationality is I think, an important element. We sometimes overly reduce what we know to the vocal, what we can articulate. Yes. And a friend of mine, Dr. Harry Ballin, who is a lawyer and incredibly articulate, but also has a Ph.D. in music theory, talks about, what does he call it? Verbal chauvinism or something like that. It's something that the chauvinism towards the word. And so if you're articulate, then you really know what you're talking about. But if you're inarticulate, you're kind of dismissed. But actually, sometimes it's maybe someone who's much less articulate, but has this deep inarticulate rationality. It's reasonable, right? And it's a good example, because what happens in politics is that there's this moral imagination, of Burke says, of experience and wisdom and trial and error over time that is part of how we have to engage politics. And the rationalist, whether he's on the right or the left, doesn't pay attention to that because it's invisible. I have a theme I repeat a lot and I've written about called ignoring the invisible. That in order for this conversation to take place, listeners have probably heard me talk about this before, so apologies. But in order for this conversation to take place, what has to happen? Well, we're in architecture with wood, and if it's a building, there's rebar and there's all these structural things, and then it's warm. There's electricity. We have bandwidth. We don't have to carry sidearms because we live in a community where there's reasonable peace, and on and on. I mean, you start to think about all the things that you need in order to get this, and then what you needed in order to get those. Like, well, we have the iPhone or the internet. Well, where did that come from? Well, that comes from DARPA. Okay, well, where do we get DARPA? Well, we have a tax base. And why do we have a tax base? Because we have a constitution. And why do we because we have this. Why do we believe that all men are created equal? Because, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, because we have Leviticus 19:15 talking about impartiality, and all the things that are needed to get to this moment. And the rationalist, like the piano player, says, oh, nothing matters. Right. That stuff doesn't matter. If you can't articulate it, it doesn't matter.
Right.
So you think is that a parallel?
That is a perfect parallel. Exactly the kind of thing that Oakeshott would say. I mean, the other word that comes to mind here is very much the notion of apprenticeship, which is undervalued in the present day. I mean, what do we get? That series of books called Something for Dummies, whatever it is, like computer programming for dummies. That is the ultimate rationalist approach to any activity, that like you can go out and buy one of those yellow books and then take it home and you'll be a great computer programmer or woodworker or whatever it is. And that is to undervalue exactly what you've just been talking about, all the stuff that is in the background that allows for the activity at its core to be really undertaken. The other thing Oakeshott's very good on this. He says, that stuff that is distilled down into the how-to for dummies is not pre-existing the activity. It is a distillation of the activity itself as people have practiced it over generations. So it may look to you like a book of rules, but it's not. I mean, it's a book of what people have learned. It's a distillation, but you can't take that and then thereby become a good practitioner of it. And I think that's a tremendously helpful insight to have. And to realize that really good things take a very long time. I mean, especially arts, translation of Latin or, connoisseurship and being able to have a sensibility about something that doesn't come to you after 6 months of reading about it. It comes often as a result of a lifetime and often as an apprentice. When you were talking about people being at so-and-so's elbow or knee, that's exactly how we gain the kind of finesse and ability that a real master has.
Yeah, I think that. So I actually read Wine for Dummies, which I liked. But I'm not a sommelier or a master of wine. But I think the point is exactly right, that you can learn certain things from a book. The rationalist thinks that's all there is to it.
That's exactly right.
And and when that carries into politics, as it often does, that's when bad stuff starts to happen.
That's right.
By the way, I have to say, one of my favorite parts in all the essays that I was reading on Oakeshott is, speaking of piano, is when you talked about both Liberace and Horowitz have good technique.
Yes.
But you'd probably rather want to listen to Horowitz.
Well, that is an interesting, that's why I think that's probably why I used it in that essay. Look, you can have all kinds of technical ability, and people do. There's a young pianist who, I may offend people by saying this, his name is Lang Lang.
Oh yeah, I've seen him.
And he is just a monster in terms of technique.
He's unbelievable.
He is amazing, but I don't like him very much because he's not musical in the way that I want to hear the music played. He's very expressive. He kind of takes the pieces and does what he wants with them. And, to some extent, of course, every artist does that. But I don't want to listen to him play Mozart. I'd much rather listen to Alfred Brendel play Mozart or Murray Pariah. Somebody who is
his Bach,
immersed in the tradition.
Goldbergs are beautiful. Murray Pariah's.
I actually have, yes.
Do you like those? I like those.
I do.
think they're really beautiful. But I'm not a pianist. I mean, I can make a lot of noise on the piano, but I'm not. I mean, I've studied the piano, but I'm no good.
But but technique is not the sum of mastery and excellence. It's just not. It's also this. I'll use the word. It's Oakeshott's word, sensibility, and you get it through apprenticeship, through self-examination, through watching, through appropriating things to yourself in terms of style. And it's not formulable in propositions. Yeah. And I think that's a very helpful thing for us to realize.
I think so. Let's maybe finish off with rationalism by talking about the Tower of Babel, because he writes a couple of essays using that. And that's an example that I actually use a lot. Leon Kass talks about, kind of develops it. The Tower of Babel, he has a good definition. It's this in his book on Genesis, where it's this desire, this recurring desire to solve the problems of evil through a technical means or political means. And as I mentioned to you, Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, deals with this question. I'm not sure if he correctly says the Tower of Babel, but this whole theme of this political messiah, this technical solution to the problems of evil. And I think it's I think that image is exactly right. When I think I've written a couple of essays on contemporary globalism, that there's a globalist ethos in the modern state and then the kind of global institutions that has a number of elements to it. I think it's, tends to be philosophically materialist. and I'll put a link up to this essay. I have 2 essays where I do it. I'm still working on the other ones, but this kind of materialist, it has a plastic anthropology to it. And it has this primacy of the technical, which I think is 2 parts. One, that if you can do it, it's morally fine. And that, everything has a technical solution. So like I give the example of Yuval Harari, who thinks death is just a glitch. But one of the images I use is that it's a recurrent concept of the Tower of Babel, that it's a technical solution to man's problems, which I think is, in a sense, where Oakeshott aligns with like people like Eric Voegelin, modern thinkers like that, Ratzinger, on this modern, and Solzhenitsyn, modern tendency to come up with a scheme to solve the problems. And it's hyper-rationalist, and I think it's non-poetic, it's a limited mode, et cetera. Maybe could you just, one, do you think I'm right in my reading of that? And then, or any critiques, maybe you disagree with what I'm saying. And then also, can you explain Oakeshott's use of the Tower of Babel?
Yeah, I do think you're right. I know that Voegelin had similar ideas. It's hard to explain exactly what Oakeshott meant, although I'll try. I can tell you that he did write 2 essays called The Tower of Babel. One of them is in Rationalism and Politics, and it was written in the middle of the century, I think. And it's basically setting out 2 forms of the moral life. One of them is basically the rationalist morality, which is the notion that you can distill things down into technical precepts, and then you can live a good moral life on the basis of those rules that this is just what we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. And then he says the alternative to that is to favor a morality of habit and custom, which is actually, of course, a more conservative view. It's the idea that we didn't create all this stuff ourselves, that we can't fix all the problems of human nature ourselves, but we would do well to be attentive to the tradition that we emerged out of. And therefore, he's on balance, he says these are ideal types. Oakeshott loves to talk about ideal types. But he says, on balance, we tend to be rationalist. We follow a Tower of Babel approach to morality, but we ought to be more in favor of habit and custom, because that's where the real wisdom lies. So that's one of his essays. But then in this other essay, which is in a little book called On History, which is a collection of his essays about history, he retells the Tower of Babel, and he sets it. It's very amusing. He sets it in modern day Britain, so probably Britain of the 1970s. And he says that the Babelians decided that they were going to build an actual tower up to the heavens to displace God, because God was not giving them everything they wanted. And he tells this in a kind of fable-like way. And what he shows is that as they build the tower, all the little incidental daily pleasures of sort of normal moral life fall away. Mm. So everyone is subsumed into this great project of building. He's actually building an actual tower. So everybody starts to work for the quarries to get the stone for the tower. Mm-hmm. And then there's a whole propaganda program to support the building of the tower, and politics comes about the tower. Everything is about the tower, and there's no more, can't go to restaurants. All the sort of normal life falls away. And ultimately, the inhabitants become suspicious of the leader, and they rush up the tower, and the whole thing falls. And it's just kind of a depressing vision. But his point is to say, anytime we sort of ally all the forces and institutions of political life into one cause, into pursuing one cause, this is where it's going to lead us. And we abandon the sort of the temporal pleasures and the kind of poetic and contemplative activities in favor of pursuing this one thing. So that's a long answer to, there are 2 distinct essays, but he also thinks it's a constant human tendency that we want perfection. We want to be better than we are today. We are always looking to the future. And he finds that really quite pathological, as I do too.
Yeah, well, I think it's, the tendency part is perfect because it's in Genesis, right?
Yes.
And I think it's pretty, you sometimes, people read Genesis, okay, Jen, I don't get it or whatever. It's fantasy. Like, pay attention to Genesis, right? There's just the richness there. There's 2 things. One is a friend of mine, Rabbi Mitch Rocklin, makes this point about, so like we're called by God to complete creation. We're supposed to improve things. We're supposed to build things. We're supposed to make things better. But and I don't want to put words in his mouth, so he can correct me if I got this wrong, but at least this is my understanding, that along with that is this covenantal relationship with God. And so, but if there's no covenant, Rabbi Rockland says, then it's all left to man.
Exactly.
And so in a sense, that's why it's a temptation. And as you said, Oakeshott's, religious commitments are kind of not super clear, not very orthodox. But that's a very kind of Jewish and Christian understanding that separated from covenant, man will almost naturally build the Tower of Babel. And Ratzinger, in his fantastic essay, Benedict XVI, I should say, in his encyclical Spe Salvi, Saved by Hope, talks about how progress is not wrong in all respects, but it has to be tempered by hope. And that hope is that Jesus will deliver you, not the state. So he says man is not redeemed by the state, by technology, by politics, by the economy, right? Man is redeemed by love. And I think that's where I think it's an interesting tension. As you said, it's always in the tension. So how does that happen? I think Oakeshott, and as you write about, and Voegelin, both see the de-Christianized West is even more susceptible to this Tower of Babel element.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, do you maybe just develop that quickly? Because that might surprise people.
Voegelin is really good on this too, because one of his most famous images is this idea that man exists in the metaxy, in the in-betweenness between God on the one hand and just the pure material on the other. And that he calls that, everybody overuses the word tension. I know that, but Voegelin talks about it as a tension, and it is a tension. If we understand ourselves rightly, see that we are not gods and that we're hopefully not beasts either. But we live in the place that, we want to be like God. We want to be perfect. We want to be immortal. And I think now to turn to Oakeshott, he sees that very clearly, that there's this tremendous dissatisfaction with the present, and we want to be engaged. Part of the rationalist problem is that we want perfection as a state, but we also want it personally, and that's not going away.
Nope.
And I think there are more positive ways of thinking about this desire for perfection, but it's a danger in just the way that Voegelin points out, because if you go too far to one side, you're not exactly what's the right way of expressing this? You're sort of neglecting the human condition. You are in the middle.
Yeah, I think the way I sometimes describe this is like, and I hear back to the Garden of Eden, right? So Eve is delighted she's attracted to the fruit, to the world. It's an attraction. And she wants to be like God and wants to be attracted. And I think then taking that further, that our challenge as human persons is, because we're in this middle, either we want to be like God, make ourselves like God, become gods, or we want to live like animals.
Exactly.
And both of those create misery and unhappiness, small and large, right? Meaning individually and politically and socially. And that what we need to do is the hardest thing, is to live like a human person created in the image of God who's not God. And that's hard.
It is hard. And I wonder, the way you were putting it just now, it seems like you could certainly act like a beast and pursue pleasure at all costs. And it does seem like many people are doing that at the moment. The other option is, of course, you'll never get there in terms of being perfect. But yeah, I don't have much to add here except to say that I think you've diagnosed it correctly.
You know what I thought about, there is in a sense, in the tradition, in the Eastern tradition, it's called theosis. The Eastern Catholic and the Orthodox tradition is called theosis. In the West, it's called deiformity. So you see this in the Church Fathers, you see it in St. Bonaventure. That the theosis is maybe the theological response to that tension, so that you become increasingly like God in this path to holiness, where you then become more fully human, right?
Yes.
And so in becoming more fully human, you become like God, less like the animal, but it's the appropriate way of understanding yourself in relationship to the Creator, at which you're not, right?
Exactly.
You're not the savior of the world, right? But you're called to participate in the redemptive work of God and in completing creation. So I hadn't thought about this, but you were saying it like maybe this is very, just kind of struck me. This is where theosis and deiformity is so powerful, because it is, in a sense, I say answer in quotes, but it's the orientation to wrestle. Like how do I deal with the despair of either being a beast or trying to be a god, neither of which will give any satisfaction.
No, you're absolutely right. And again, that's in very different ways. That's what both Oakeshott and Voegelin are talking about. And I think there's a lot of fruit for comparison of the two, if people want to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know Voegelin's work more than Oakeshott, so I kept thinking, oh, this sounds like Voegelin. Okay, so let's maybe, this has been super helpful. I guess there's maybe one more thing on Oakeshott I want to say, and then I'd like to talk about more really practical things, like what does it mean today? But I guess maybe one quick other thing that you talk about a lot in your essays is that you use this word disposition.
Mm-hmm.
So one of your essays is the conservative disposition in a revolutionary age, and the other one is a disposition of delight. So I think I wouldn't be doing justice if we didn't talk at least. Could you maybe articulate this idea of disposition, what it is in Oakeshott, and also what attracts you to it, why you think it's so valuable that you want people to think about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And disposition, I think, is a super important word for Oakeshott. He talks about it. He uses it in his writing. What's the difference between a disposition and, say, a view or an outlook or a philosophy? I mean, in a way, this is to come back to our discussion of rationalism. Conservatism, for him, is not a set of precepts. In fact, he criticizes Russell Kirk for his what is it, 10 or 12 sort of precepts in the conservative mind. He says, no, it's not a list. It is a disposition, and nothing is required to be believed to be a conservative. It is to have a certain disposition. Okay, well, that sounds all very vague, doesn't it? Well, what does it mean? The heart of the conservative disposition for Oakeshott is this thing we've been talking about already, this disposition to enjoy, to live in the present, not in the past or in the future, to be appreciative, to engage in activities that can be understood as ends in themselves, as against constant practical striving. And that is a very unusual understanding of conservatism, especially in the present day. You know, Michael, we may get to this later, but there's certainly a strong strand of conservative rationalism where, you know, people say, well, if you don't believe this, you're not a real conservative. Oakeshott would have said, no, this is the wrong way of understanding it. So for him, it is a way of, I guess the best way to say it is a way of being in the world, and he calls that a disposition, and he thinks it's really the essence of being conservative.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe let's talk about that now, because I think that this is what, when I was reading this, and I'm trying to find, there's one of the essays where you have a very good, I talk about a little bit about the weaknesses in this position. So I think there's something, here's what I would say, and again, correct it if you think, or maybe we just disagree, or maybe I'm misunderstanding Oakeshott, or so feel free to debate this. But it seems to me there's two things going on with this disposition. One of them I like. One of them I'm less comfortable. I don't like as much. So the one I like is he makes it, I think he's right that conservatism isn't simply kind of a list of the 10 top things we need to do in order to, solve the world's problems. And I think there, conservatism becomes a type of rationalism, right? And I think that is exactly right. And I think it's very relevant today, as you pointed out. I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of ideology on the right that goes under the name conservatism that's really not conservative. It's just right. And I don't mean fascist. I mean, it's an American right-wing version of progressivism, right? It's a certain,
I think that's right.
And I think, it's too easy just to say, oh, it's right, it's fascist. I don't mean it's fascist. It's just, and let's talk about this, and we don't really have too much of a conservative political movement as much as we have an American right-wing political movement. And I don't mean fascist. I mean, yes, there's probably some fascist elements in it, but I'm talking about, generally speaking, it's just kind of a right-wing conservative movement that's rationalistic in Oakeshottian terms. That's, maybe better than the progressive one. I'll go with that. But it's not, something's missing. It's too hyper-rationalistic. And in that, I think Oakeshott's disposition position is really good. So my critique is, he said, like you said, he critiques Kirk for confusion, quotes, and he critiques Hayek, I thought was it, for planning against all planning,
right.
A plan against all planning, right? So, which I think is quite clever. But that there are principles that I would say underlie a conservative disposition, right? And that being is good, that it's intelligible, that the law of non-contradiction holds, that democracy of the dead matters, that truth can be known, even though it's not maybe always known, but it's knowable. I mean, I could go on further, and then more political elements of this idea of moderation, of the poetic mode. I mean, those seem to be principles of the disposition. Am I maybe
No, you're absolutely
being pedantic or what? What's wrong?
They are principles of the disposition, but I don't think that the principles don't direct the disposition. I think that's again, I mean, it's this epistemological point with Oakeshott, that you are right to pull all those things out of his work, and they are all, I think almost all of them are right. But it's the way they're used that matters to him. I mean, in the sense that, I could imagine some 16-year-old or maybe very few 16-year-olds would be attracted to Oakeshott. But let's say somebody is studying him in college and says, well, I want to be an Oakeshottian conservative. And so tell me what the principles are to become this. And you could pull those things out, but it's not as if you can obey these principles. This is Oakeshott's point again and again. It's that it arises out of experience, out of I hate to use this, I won't use this word, but I'll just say it, lived experience, because it's such an abused phrase, but it is a lived experience. You live, I guess all experience is lived, but you live as a conservative among other people who are also conserving things and being grateful for their inheritances. And that's how you come to the disposition. The principles don't guide it or tell you, well, if you do this, then you'll be an Oakeshottian conservative. Mm-hmm. Does that get at all what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I just kind of think it's a bit of a weakness, and maybe I'm missing it. I just think, but I think it's how do I say it? And again, I might be wrong. So it seems to me like appropriately a reactionary weakness, meaning it's an appropriate reaction to a type of conservatism that, like, these are the 10 things you must do to be conservative. If you don't hold those, you're not a conservative. Well, that's not a conservative disposition to have that position.
Right.
Right. And I think that, but I still think, like, I don't know, there are principles that, good is to be done and pursued and evil is to be avoided. You can't obtain a good by doing an evil. There are principles that then, in a sense, restrain us from the temptation of rationalism. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's how I'm seeing it. That's the part I felt like was a little bit not satisfying to me.
Well, and I think
the political part's right, but the philosophical principles seem to be like, if you don't have those, then you can become unhinged into rationalism too easily.
Right. And I think Oakeshott took a lot of that for granted in his age. I don't think we can take that stuff for granted anymore. This sort of basic logical principles and the kinds of things you just mentioned. I mean, those are now debated by people all over the place, but they weren't in his time. And I think he took all of that as, when I talk about inheritance, I think he inherited sort of the Western Christian tradition, whether or not he was a Christian himself. And that did underlie his thought. Yeah. The other thing, he's very, in terms of, people may be thinking, well, this isn't much about politics at all, but he did in his final book lay out a distinction between what he called enterprise association and civil association. And he made a very convincing case for something that we absolutely do not have in the contemporary West, which is the idea that government ought to be more or less preserver of the rule of law, stepping back and allowing people to pursue their own self-chosen activities. Now, that is 100% not the view of contemporary American politics, is it? I mean, we're focused on very concrete ends, goods goods determined by one party that we must pursue. That is not at all what Oakeshott would have wanted. Yeah. That is what he called enterprise association. So he loves these ideal types. Enterprise association is the way politics is now. Civil association is the way it really ought to be to be fair to all, because it doesn't coerce people into pursuing things that they've not chosen to do. Yeah. So he's very big defender of freedom, sort of individual and civil freedom in that book.
Well, that's actually, I'm so glad you brought it up, because that's something I do want to talk about. And I think you've heard me talk a little bit before. Like, I have this, everybody's got their own options, right? There's the Benedict option. Somebody wrote the beer option. A friend of mine, Carrie Gress, wrote the Marian option. And so I have my own option, the Tocqueville option. And the Tocqueville option is really a decentralized revitalization of associations. And I've talked about this on other podcasts that I think there's actually a connection, and maybe a very positive connection to decentralized technology and distributed ledger technology of blockchain, because I think we need to build lots of civil associations, if I'm getting the right Oakeshottian distinction, lots of private, voluntary, functional associations, and we have to opt out from big state, big tech, big government, and build these places where people can actually flourish. And so I think that's actually a really important point. So maybe we could talk about associations and the challenges today. I would like to circle back and make sure we talk about the contemporary conservative political movement and maybe what some of the weaknesses are there. I think one of them is we, and I say we because I'm trying not to blame other people here, have not been as active in building actual civil associations as we should have been. We've kind of taken it for granted that we have liberty. And this goes to, I guess, two questions, a practical and a theoretical question of, in order to be an Oakeshottian conservative, you kind of need a reasonable amount of space to live out your freedom and your responsibility. And you bring up in your essays, and a couple times, Gertrude Himmelfarb's kind of critique/worry of Oakeshott, that he wasn't doing enough. That he was a little okay, you get to opt out here, but what do we do when the state's kind of pushing down on us? And if you look at contemporary equality laws, if you look at, just as you mentioned earlier, social media, the kind of what I call big culture is everywhere. So the opting out and building communities of civil associations that are private, functional, and where people can flourish, and they can also play a political role limiting the state, that's harder now than it was, not only when Oakeshott was writing, but one of your pieces is written in, I think, 2012. I mean, it's even harder now, right?
Yes.
So I guess there's a couple of things we can parse out here, but I think it would be interesting to talk about, one, let's talk about civil associations. Can we build functional decentralized associations? And by functional, I mean kind of what Nisbet talks about in The Quest for Community when he talks about Ortega y Gasset makes this point. Families don't just do things to hang out. They have a function.
Yes.
And in order to revitalize the family, it can't just be a launching pad. It has to be a function where you do things together. It's a positive view of homeschool or family businesses or whatever. Same thing with other organizations. You can't just hang out. And right now we have really little individuals with a big state and no kind of intermediary institutions in between. So I guess that's a lot to say to maybe let's parse out two questions. How do we think about building actual civil associations? And then two, does the Oakeshottian disposition, is it enough in 2021, or does it have to be combined with something else? What do you think?
That is the question. That last question you just asked me, and it's a very hard one. And it is the objection so many people have to Oakeshott. They say, oh, well, I love this vision of the poetic, and I love the vision of things as ends themselves. But you can't really do that if you're being coerced into sort of a woke progressive school situation and you can't exit from it. You are not being left free to do things in your own way, by your own lights, with your own family or church. You are being coerced. And I think, people like Rod Dreher are not wrong to say, yes, there are some real dangers here that the state is going to intrude into places it even hasn't so far, and we are not going to have any realm of freedom left. Yep. That is a huge problem. And I don't think Oakeshott does have a good answer for it. I mean, I don't think, first of all, I think he was living in England at a time where the idea that the state could interfere as much as it does now would have been hard to believe.
Right.
He saw a little bit of this. Of course, he lived till up to 1990, so he would have seen some of the advances of technology, but not what we've seen in the last 40 years. So in a way, I mean, I don't know what his answer would be. I think he would be favorable to your Tocqueville option, though, as am I, which is to say that, well, the only way we can preserve any of our ability to determine our lives for ourselves is to have these smaller associations, starting with the family, moving on to things like schools, private schools that could be started by a group of people who are like-minded, churches, those sorts of things. And then, obviously all sorts of civic associations could blossom too. I mean, the real danger there, though, is one that, what if the state says, well, we don't want those?
Right.
And many people say, well, the state is already undermining the family. Certainly the Equality Act and some of the transgender ideology is trying to undermine parental authority and all of this sort of thing. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I don't. This is one place where I don't think he does have an answer to what's going on right now. He would hate it. He would abhor it. I think the one positive and constructive thing I could say, he would say, and what I try to say is that, yeah, that's all true, but let's still try. Let's still try to build those associations and to cultivate a disposition that can be appreciative. I mean, I think where I differ with many contemporary conservatives is to say it's all bad. It's all terrible right now. We're in an unprecedented crisis. And I want to say, well, we're always at the edge of this kind of abyss. Sometimes it seems a little worse, and maybe we're at a little worse place, but that doesn't relieve us of trying to do what is uniquely human and good.
Yeah, that's good. So I think let's go there then, because I think this is one of the parts of of a number of your essays that I think is really great and inspiring, and I think it's important. I gave a lecture 11 years ago on Robert Nisbet that is actually, it's an episode on the podcast. I turned an episode. And I remember at the end of the lecture, I was kind of thinking as going through Nisbet and the idea of functional associations, like, well, I can do stuff right now.
Yes.
And I can lament all the things that are going on, and there's bad stuff going on. And we have to be thinking, and you've heard me talk about this before, we need to be thinking politically, legally, economically, et cetera. But where I think we need to focus most, and I don't neglect those other areas, is in two areas. One is actually building functional decentralized associations that are opting out. So like health insurance, health care, as you said, education. Even I think this is on the technical side, but I think even using decentralized blockchain technologies so that we can get payments and we can use maybe wireless or storage documents. Like, don't put your stuff on Google Docs that reads your stuff, right? So like opt out of some of that big tech stuff, opt out of state things as much as possible, and try to build them while we can. So that's, I think, important and something that I'm actually working on and we'll be talking about more on the podcast. But I think the other thing that we can do that's right now is to cultivate this life that takes seriously the poetic mode, as you talked about.
Yes.
And you say things like, have a dinner party, read poetry together, recover traditions. And you have a quote in one of your essays, actually it's in the essay, A Disposition of Delight, by Walter Bagehot, where you talk about, like, it's an 1854 study of Macaulay, and you're talking about this idea of like what we should do as conservatives. This is the quote: talk of the ways of spreading a wholesome conservatism throughout this country. Give painful lectures, distribute weary tracts, and perhaps you can give an argumentative answer to a few objections. But as far as communicating and establishing your creed are concerned, try a little pleasure. The way to keep up old customs is to enjoy old customs. The way to be satisfied with the present state of things is to enjoy that state of things. And you make this point in a number of essays and you're speaking, just that we can be so subsumed, is that right? Or
Yes.
Or obsessed with the political things around us and talk about how it's so important to read the great books that we forget to read the great books.
Yes.
I think that's important. Do you want to just develop that a little bit? Because I think that's it's a theme throughout your work that I think is, one, inspiring and convicting to me. And I think just very, very important, because if we're going to actually respond to the hyper-rationalism of our time, we need to live more fully human lives. And I've talked about this on the podcast before. Both, I think, Wojtyła and I think George Orwell make this point separately, but Wojtyła explicitly, that the best response to totalitarianism is tenderness. And the best response to hyper-rationalism is, maybe to use Oakeshottian language, is a poetic engagement with the world.
Yes, I love all that you say there. Well, I just think that we have to have the courage of our convictions to continue to do the activities that we think are worthwhile. And that is, in a way, what you're talking about with the formation of institutions. And in many ways, I think the job of conservatives right now is to protect. I mean, for example, let me just give an example from my own life. I'm in a wonderful honors college in a larger university, and I'm loyal to the university, but I see my job in the honors college as a kind of work of protection. If I think that liberal learning is so good, then one, I need to engage in it, but two, I also need to make sure that it can continue to go on for the next generation of students and to model it for those students in the way it was modeled for me by my teachers. So it is a kind of, I mean, this is deeply conservative, it's a passing down of an inheritance, and it's a preservation of institutions. I mean, Yuval Levin is so good on all this, and I think he's right. The work has got to be of rejuvenation and of protection of institutions. And so, by institutions, I don't necessarily mean big things. I also mean things like family. Of course, probably the most important institution. So that is a kind of counter to the grumpiness and the sky is falling mode that a lot of contemporary conservative writers have, which I think is overblown. I don't think things are great in our contemporary political life, but writing yet another article about how bad things are doesn't really help things.
You know, it's like this is related to that thing I've had after the Nisbet lecture I mentioned, is that, yeah, things aren't very great, but I can do stuff still.
Yes.
I got to do it now so I don't look back and think, well, instead of lamenting, why didn't I just do it? You make this point again in Disposition of Delight. It says, society stays sustained and rejuvenated not by those who are engaged in politics, but by artists, poets, philosophers, and scholars, people whose distance from the world is not merely accidental, but essential to their work. The emotional and intellectual integrity and insight for which they stand is something foreign to the political world. And you continue, that's a quote, then you can do the conservative is not defined by taking the right political positions, but by recognizing and preserving the beauty the world has to offer, and then by engaging as much as possible in activities that are worthwhile in themselves, especially friendship, love, aesthetic contemplation, conversation, and liberal learning. I think that's an inspirational thing. It's like and in some ways it's almost like a checklist, right? Mm-hmm. So it suits our desires for to-do lists and look to the future while we're actually living in the present. Like, I think it's important, passing on liberal learning, aesthetic contemplation, like, do these things. Don't just spend your time. I say this to myself, but I said to everybody, don't spend our time only looking at the news and looking for the next, doom scrolling opportunity of the thing that's bad. Be attentive, be prudent, understand the world you're in. There's bad stuff out there, and we have to be careful. And there's progressive ideology that has a totalitarian element to it, no doubt. But like, I asked myself, like, am I looking at my phone to find the latest bad thing that's happening instead of reading a beautiful fairy tale to my little children who are standing there?
Yeah.
That's your point. I mean, I think that's a convicting point of what you're saying. Maybe I'm simplifying.
No, it is. It really is. And it sounds very simple, and it is very simple, but it's hard to do. And I think it's because, my husband and I, he's a political philosopher at Baylor. He teaches political theory and other things. And he has an image that I am just going to shamelessly take from him, which is that the work of, even the work of protection, which I've just been talking about as important, and I think it is not the work of doing the thing itself. So you can imagine, a world-class violinist, I'll use another musical example, who is so good that he's just the right person to go out and defend classical music. But what happens when he goes out and defends classical music? Well, he's not playing. He's not doing the work that is at the heart of what needs to be defended. So somehow we've got to get ourselves back from that defense and constant sort of warlike state to doing the things themselves. Now, granted, I just made the point that you need to defend and protect, and that's all true. Mm-hmm. But when that stuff gets in the way of actually living life in ways that are deeply meaningful and important in themselves, then you've kind of missed the point of life.
You make this point, right, with the families and universities. Say, so if you think liberal learning is great, read and teach.
Yes, do it.
If you want to save the family, have a family.
Exactly.
And love your spouse and take care of your children. And I think that's inspirational because, it's easy to get into the culture war or the political war and miss the fact that you're just ignoring those fundamental elements. And that's what's going to actually have, in a sense, the most attractive element. It was something I was at an ISI conference. In fact, your husband was there at that one. And at one point, like, people were like, well, what do we do? And I said, well, build attractive, I used Peter Berger's idea of plausibility structures that make people want what you have.
Yes.
Right. I mean, so, I used to teach a course when I taught undergraduates called Philosophy of Love and Sexuality, that I stole from a professor of mine, Dr. Michael Healy. And part of the idea there, and the idea of like love, is that once you understand the potential of what actual love and marriage can be, you don't want the fake stuff. You don't want that. It's boring, right? And I think that's a real advantage in anthropology, both theoretically and then lived anthropology. It's much more attractive. It's theoretically coherent and just much more attractive and beautiful than the plastic anthropology. And by the way, I like the term lived experience. I think Jay Richards,
yeah,
of course.
I do.
Yeah. So Jay's a good friend, and been on the podcast a couple of times. So the other day on Twitter, Jay's like, "What's the difference between experience and lived experience?" And so I responded, and this is like basically the response. Like, I think experience is experience that you generally have, right? Like, I kind of was teasing Jay, like, Jay has learned from experience. It's important to make distinctions, right? That experience is something you have, but a lived experience, I think, and maybe it's overused and abused, but I kind of like it because the lived experience of being in love is a refutation of biological reductionism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in that lived experience, if that's what I know, it's probably you'll know because you're in the academy and I'm not, so I don't hear all the. But in that sense, I think lived experience is something where this conservative disposition, right, that takes reality seriously, has so much to offer because it works.
Yes.
And that's the democracy of the dead.
Yes.
Right. So it's the non-rationalist position of Oakeshott. Do you think
You've put it beautifully? Yes, I have almost nothing to add there. I think that's exactly right. I object to lived experience just because it's been kind of appropriated by the left. But I if it hadn't been, I would use it too, because I do think there's something about it. Like you can hear about it's important to find a spouse and establish a marriage, and you can be told that or exhorted that, but until you see it in practice or experience it for yourself, it's not really concrete to you. Right.
So like marriage is very good for male salaries.
Yes.
And also higher graduation rates for children, right? Or the lived experience of marriage, I'm sticking with it, that you have a deep intersubjective relationship with your spouse that grows over time and children are welcomed into the world who exist for their own sake and not just for you. Mm-hmm. And then later grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And you have participated actively in building a civilization of love.
Yes.
That's awesome.
That's the conservative job. I mean, and you don't have to be conservative to do it, but that's right. The kind of activity that Oakeshott recommends, and that I'm trying to say we can still do that in the midst of all sorts of craziness happening at the state level and at the cultural level.
Yeah. So let's maybe then wind back to that, and then we can. I'm really grateful for your time, but let's maybe wind back to that, and that's the challenge. That's the question that Himmelfarb raised. It's a question that you raise with Oakeshott, and it's also the time that we're in. And so maybe we can talk just a little bit about contemporary conservative movement, some of the political theory that's going on, and political ideas and the activism among the right. And let me try to articulate this in a bit, and then maybe you can correct it. We can just do it. I think about the job of, as you say, from the conservative disposition is to build the civilization of love, right? But there's also a political task. And how do we think about the political task without becoming overly rationalist, I guess, is the question. Mm-hmm. Because I think that's a danger in the conservative movement right now. Okay, so for the record, I mean, I could talk about all the problems of the progressive movement, but it's almost obvious because progressivism, a lot of it's influenced by different forms of Marxianism, of socialism, that are philosophically materialist and that are, in Voegelin's words, immanentizing the eschaton.
Yes.
That's the nature of it. The nature is that we're going to have a technical solution to the problems of evil, sin, suffering, death, hunger, and etc. That's the nature of it. So conservatism is supposed to be like, whoa, hold on a minute. But it seems as if increasingly, and I'm not saying it's only now, the Anglo-conservative movement, which is, Edmund Burke and then Kirk and Oakeshott and Nisbet and influenced by John Paul II and all, that was just random. There's so many, people that increasingly, as I said, it's just a right-wing political movement that's a less false narrative, maybe, and a just kind of less progressive, less rationalistic response to the progressives. So I could critique progressives, but I think it might be more interesting to say, what's going on in the conservative movement with these political ideas? Is it just a overreaction to the threats of a very increasingly intrusive state? What do you think?
Well, that's a great question and a big question. I think the most troubling thing that I'm seeing now is to hear from conservatives that, look, the left has been in power and the left has used power and it's been very successful at achieving its ends. Now we need to do the same thing. We need to use power in exactly the same way that they're using power. So, for example, this is Adrian Vermeule's argument, as I understand it, that, look, the left has used the administrative state in order to make all sorts of things happen. We ought to use the administrative state as conservatives in the same way for the right ends and for what we call the common good. And it is in a way, it's a kind of repudiation of the whole tradition you just talked about, the Kirk, the Burke, the Oakeshott, Nisbet, all of it, because it is as statist as the left. It would just be supposedly for good ends that Vermeule and others are going to determine for us. And I'm as frankly uncomfortable with that as I would be with, being ruled by Biden and Harris. It's not that different. Someone else out there is making decisions about the common good and sort of definitely undervaluing the human freedom, individuality, the ability to make decisions for oneself and one's family and one's community. So I think that's one way in which this new right movement is concerning to me.
Would you say that would fall into Oakeshott's rationalism?
Well, it is to say, and they're not wrong about this. It is to say that, look, we've got problems to solve. Let's apply this technique to it, which is to take over the administrative state. Let's say that's the solution. Yes, it's rationalist in that way.
So, I think. All right. So here's just a kind of a reaction. Tell me what you think. So I'm very wary of that idea because I'm wary of state power, and I'm wary of it. I think for a lot of reasons. I'm wary of state power. I don't think it's appropriate use of political power. I do think there's a didactic power of law. I do not think law and morality are separate. No. I think law is the legislation of morality, et cetera. So it's not a relativist position. It's more like, how far should the administrative state go in intervening in people's lives? I think is a one fear. And that when you build the apparatus of the administrative state, the apparatus is there. So this is where we're now. And I think the idea is, well, let's go get it and we'll take it and we'll use it for ourselves. One, that might be Dungeons and Dragons. Like, that ain't going to happen. Okay, that's a fantasy. Maybe I'm wrong. But let's say, okay. Two, if you get it and you build it up and you use it for this, that the apparatus is there for people with a radical, progressive vision of the world. They can use the administrative state too. It's not like, I think it's just playing with fire that makes me nervous.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Just on that last point, you're right. What doesn't seem to be accounted for in this is that, let's build it up. Let's use it for the right ends. And there's this assumption somehow that the right people are going to be in charge of determining those right ends and putting them into practice. But you're absolutely right. Once that apparatus is there, then, anyone can use it and they can enforce their view of the common good upon us, which I suppose...
Which is what we're happening.
Yeah, which is what is happening right now. So why is that any better?
I think, right. And I think it's also, I also don't think they're taking the public choice problem seriously enough. And that is just regulatory capture, right? Capture by powerful interest groups. That it's like, it seems to me that it's a bit naive that somehow you're going to control this, this beast, this Frankenstein, this, it might actually come back and hurt you. That's one. But I think I could see people saying, and I don't know all of the arguments of Adrian Voegelin, I've just read a little bit of them, but I could see, I've seen it in other places though. So I'm not an expert in this. I could see people saying, well, yeah, you're so naive. I mean, give me a break, they would say to us.
Yes.
This is like, are you not serious about what's happening with the Equality Act and with parental rights being taken away? I mean, we're not in a position where you can just talk about writing another article about the little platoons. We got to do something now.
I know, that
or
is
we're going
the
to be
argument.
crushed. So what do you say to that?
Oh gosh, well, why do you have to ask the hardest questions?
This is why you're getting paid no money for this.
I don't have an Oakeshottian answer for it. I don't think Oakeshott had an answer for it.
What about an Elizabeth Corrian answer for it?
Let me say this. I do think...
Look, there's no way that you and your husband, two political philosophers, don't have this conversation at the dinner table.
Well, sometimes we do. I mean, look, this is as I understand it, the issue, the reason, especially so many younger conservatives are attracted to this vision of state power, because they say, yeah, all this moderation and sort of rule of law stuff that may have been good in the past is not relevant now. In fact, there's a young conservative I heard on an Acton podcast recently. His name is Nate Hockman, and he said, yeah, we of the under 30 generation are tired of just losing battle after battle. The culture is lost. The political battles are being lost. We've got to do something different. We've got to seize the levers of power to the degree we can and do something. I guess I am simply just constitutionally wary of large concentrations of power for just the reason you talked about. I don't want other people making decisions for me about lots of things. I do value liberty, and I think this is one of the things that is undervalued in some of these new right folks. Liberty is understood only as a kind of left-leaning, progressive, atomistic liberty, like the kind that true conservatives would reject too. But liberty, properly understood, which is a traditional understanding of liberty, I'm all for, and I want to keep that. So I haven't answered your question.
It's hard.
It's a super hard question.
And I think that's also why probably we need to also have charity among each other and disagreeing, because we're trying to solve complex problems of a hyper-intrusive state. And I mean, I understand I understand the impulses. I read a lot of those different people in these areas, and not as much as you do, but a lot of times I'll say, well, I agree with the critique. I agree with the problem.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the solution is the right one. And so again, partially, and this is maybe because I have that fear of the large state, is I think we need maybe more associationalism, right? And I think this is not, I talk about Nisbet, but this is actually, I would argue, a medieval approach as well.
Yeah.
And this is maybe a political theory question that's complex. So, but let me just throw it out, and maybe we might have to talk about it in another time to get to detail with it. But, the medieval world was not this very hyper-centralized element. There were and Nisbet writes about this, for example, there's just tons of competing associations and voluntary organizations, and, the kings and the barons and the groups and the cities and the independent charters, and they were wrestling with one another. And this is where representative came out. This is where the commercial society developed, the commercial revolution between 800 and 1400. By 1200, Florence was considered by our terms a capitalist society. It wasn't industrialized like modern industrial, it was a capitalist society. And I think in a sense, the answer to me, and maybe this is naive too, I get it. Okay. I mean, if I'm on the kind of Adrian Vermeule side, I would say, you're totally naive. There's no way. You can't do that in the modern administrative state. You got to get the levers of power, and that's the only deal. Maybe they're right. I don't think so, but maybe. So, but I want to have a little humility here. But I do think that there is, in a sense, an associational element. Now, that's a political move too, because that means we're going to reduce the power of the state and create more opt-out elements for people to live. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be a political battle. That's not separate from a political battle, because some of those things aren't allowed. We're going to have to create new types of membership organizations to pull back the state. And I'm kind of going on here, but I'm trying to get to the question. It seems to me, among some of the groups in the new right, like say the integralist movement, and which is kind of like the Catholic state idea, that they're reacting to the bad things that are out there, but that they've maybe politically or intellectually, making an error, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know more of this than I do, that they're identifying and conflating political liberty in the modern period with liberalism.
Yes.
And not realizing that there's actually political liberty prior to Lockean liberalism in
Right.
quotes, et cetera.
Right.
And that in fact, the American tradition, but also the European tradition comes out of a more complex understanding of the human person where liberty and associationism and limited state are actually part of a tradition. And that and this is maybe wrong, but it's almost like, I would say they're almost buying into either A, the administrative state, which is a very modern view of the world, or B, one kind of politicized state post-Reformation in the Catholics and Protestants, where there's a centralized state there as well. And they're thinking, oh, that's the kind of Catholic tradition. But no, actually, there's a really broad Catholic, and I'm talking about the integralists specifically, a really broad Catholic tradition that is decentralized, has commercial society, and takes moral law and natural law seriously. I don't know. That was long, but...
Well, no, I think you're right, though. And that requires a knowledge of history that I don't think a lot of young people have. And frankly, I don't have that knowledge myself either. But then to make assertions about liberalism as this one terrible thing, as many people do in the modern age, is really to misrepresent it. So, of course, if you think of liberalism as just where we are with progressivism right now, that's not great. I agree, but again, a richer view would take into account the fact that it's much more complicated than the easy story goes of the integralists.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the appeal of Patrick Deneen's work and other people, that it's kind of, if liberalism equals what you say it equals, okay, well then we're fine. But does it? I think
that's right. And a lot of people have taken that. A lot of very qualified people have taken that up, and they said, no, it doesn't. But that's not an easy story to tell. So it's not as palatable for social media.
Right. So, there's anything else you want to say about how to understand this question of integralism? We just brought it up. Anything else? Any comments you have? What are some of the good things, bad things that you're worried about? You have anything else to say on that?
Well, I don't have a lot to say, except to say that I think if we're going to get at this, we've got to understand the motivation of people who are embracing it. Why is this why is this and sort of common good conservatism, and Vermeule, these people are obviously speaking to a large group of especially younger conservatives. Rod Dreher, on the Benedict option, he's talking to a very devoted following.
Mm-hmm. And he has a lot of good things to say.
He does.
Yeah.
No, he does. But we've got to get at why are people embracing these so-called solutions to the problems of the moment? And I think it's because, it offers a kind of excitement. We're going to do something new. We're going to try something that hasn't been tried before, or maybe it's been tried a long time ago. But it's sort of an adventure. Whereas what you or I are counseling, or what Oakeshott is counseling, is to say, yeah, let's live within the constraints where we find ourselves in, and do the best we can, and build institutions. That's not as rousing a response to the moment.
Yeah, and I think maybe in the defense of that, I mentioned this at the Philadelphia Society, where you and I both were speaking on different panels. I said, I think one of the reasons why conservatism, there's a reaction, is in many ways the conservative movement failed, right? Mm-hmm. You had this conservative movement, and all the presidents and the House, everything, and we've lost all the culture.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is I think conservatives made an error of identifying socialism with its economic elements and missing the anthropological.
I think that's right.
I also think free marketers, of which I'm a supporter of competitive markets, have been maybe naive or simplistic, or too, the market will all work it out, which of course it won't. I'm not saying everybody thinks that. At the Acton Institute where I work, we're wrestling with these questions all the time. But I do think that's a problem. And I think I could hear somebody listening to this conversation and heard what you said and say, well, living with the constraints we have, those constraints are getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and we're not going to be able to have the Oakeshottian conservative disposition, because it's not going to be legal.
Yeah.
And I think that's a
very scary possibility.
Yeah, that's the real tension. But I do think also, and I think this is maybe what you're getting at about life beyond politics, is that at the same time, as we deal with all these things, it's very important, correct me if I'm misrepresenting you, that we do get some lessons from Oakeshott and Voegelin about the dangers of rationalism, and from Oakeshott and from Pieper and others about the importance of action. And C.S. Lewis in like, what's the
Learning
essay?
in Wartime.
Learning in Wartime, right? That, and the other one is in the Atomic Age.
Yes.
Right? How should we live? There's going to be everything's going to be destroyed. Well, we should live as if, he said, we're on a sinking ship. We already know that.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows that. We're going to die. So we should live exactly like, now, like we would if we were going to die tomorrow.
Yes.
Because, and that is, and he actually goes back to a lot of the themes that you evoke, right? Playing the piano, reading to children, making dinner, having conversations. He says playing darts, being in the sacrament of the present moment, and that living out a human life, I think is very, very powerful. And we have to make sure that we do that. And by the way, neither I nor you are saying like, those people with whom we disagree in the conservative movement aren't doing that, and we are.
No,
nobody's saying that.
Of course
they
not.
may be doing it better than I do. I'm not there. But I think that's the danger. We mentioned Rod Dreher, and in one of his early books, the CrunchyCon book, which I read the back and I had a lot of agreement to. I read the whole thing. I didn't really like it so much. I thought his Benedict option was better. I haven't read Live by Lies yet, but I've heard good things, and I've read your review of it. But one point, Rod Dreher was talking about, I think, eating carrots, going to the supermarket and buying organic food. And he kind of said it's a political act. And I thought that was wrong. I thought that's what the progressive is doing. I don't think it's a conservative way to think about eating vegetables as a political act. I think that's a diseased infection of politics into our life.
Yeah.
That's not healthy.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, there's one way in which I have at times made the argument that, everything we do is political in the sense that it is a forming of other people. So the family is political in that way, that you are,
sure.
And doing scholarship is political in that it is trying to extend, truth to people who wouldn't see it otherwise. There's a way in which everything can be political. That's
Correct.
not the way that's not the way Rod, I think, is using it there. He's saying, he's using the progressive understanding of everything we do ought to be political in the way we think of politics, which is we boycott or we support certain carrot growers in the choice of buying those carrots or not buying those carrots. And I would want to say no, but there are aspects of privacy, and there are not privacy, but individual and associational action that are not part of the great political milieu that we live in right now.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't mean, he would have to articulate what he meant. I just remember reading it a couple of years ago, and I thought, no, it's not. Now, I also think food can be political, right?
Oh, it sure can.
There's crony capitalism on food. I've had Joel Salatin on this podcast and Diana Rogers on food, and hoping to have more. And I think this whole Beyond Meat movement is a disaster of hyper-rationalist technocratic politics. So food can be political, but I think that your point and the Oakeshottian point is, if we let politics infect absolutely everything we do, in a sense, we've lost to the rationalist, to the progressive, to the technocrat, in a way that I've used this example a lot. I interviewed Carlo Lancelotti on the podcast, the work of Augusto Del Noce, and this really stuck with me, and so I've used it. So apologies to listeners, you've heard this before, but this, when Del Noce points out, there was a shift with the American reaction to communism, where it moved from, we're going to defeat communism based on the truth of Christianity and et cetera, to we're going to defeat communism based on productivity, liberation, including sexual liberation. And Del Noce points out, you just accepted the Marxist categories.
Yes.
And I think that's the danger for me, and I think the danger for many people who are worried about progressive intrusion, is that we have to make sure, and maybe the insights from Oakeshott and from you, make sure you live your life.
Yeah.
And do those things that matter in the poetic mode that Oakeshott and Pieper and Lewis talk about.
You've said it beautifully. That's just right.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you very much for this. I really enjoyed reading all these essays and all your insights, and I hope we can have you back.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was just a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.